Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from Bionicme. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about survivability in game design in build systems. Just in general, in this Parley, Bionicme begins. I want to talk about the different methods of increasing survivability, commonly used in games. For this discussion, you could break down a lot of different outliers and creative takes on survivability systems in different games, but let's broadly assume a standard of there being combat between a player and enemies. The player character will have a pool of health points, which will decrease as enemies successfully attack and deal damage to the player. Seem like reasonable suppositions to me. Mitigating incoming damage from enemies is both possible and something the player will want to do, we further assume. Ooh, so I actually think that's a meaningful assumption. The degree to which the player is able to succeed in that effort is what constitutes their survivability. So this is an interesting premise to a really interesting parlay where we're going to talk about what are all the ways you could improve your survivability in games? What does it do to include them beside each other? How do they interact? What's the purpose of including these options? I think a good way to summarize your premises, and I think it's great you did that, what kind of survivability are we talking about? You're talking about survivability with build options, basically. There are a lot of games where the beginning paragraph of premises are true, like the player character has health points and will decrease as enemies successfully attack and deal damage to the player. Like, that's not, yeah, sure, that. But mitigating incoming damage is possible and something the player will want to do. I think it is useful to begin by talking about how surprisingly complicated that is. Like, that isn't that simple of a thing, I don't think. For that to be true, you need a game where it is possible to play the game without being a ascended human being a mere mortal. You will get hit sometimes. It is possible to play the game without survivability that is useful, again, for a reasonable person. There will be humans who are able to speedrun the game hitless. That exists, and that is not the behavior the game expects, and it's okay to set that aside. We say it's something like Elden Ring or whatever. You can avoid getting hit by every single attack from a boss, but 99 point plus percent of players, this will not be their experience. They will get hit sometimes. So you assume the player can build relatively minimum survivability. It's possible to play the game doing that, but there is a benefit to building some survivability. That isn't trivial in some games, or there are games where you just wouldn't meaningfully do this. An example that comes to mind would be like World of Warcraft. Damage characters like spellcasters, when I played World of Warcraft, which was 20 years ago, so give me a break here. I don't know, like an MMO like this. Often you have a lot of health, such that if enemies are attacking you with attacks that are balanced for you to survive them, you take like some medium amount of hits to die, it doesn't really matter. And when bosses attack you, the game is designed so only tanks have the damage reduction to survive that, so you will just die. And it isn't really built to be profitable for the damage character to build a little survivability. The game will put in like I call them a wet your pants move, where you freeze yourself in a block of ice or teleport away. A quick little ability that gives you a very absolute form of survivability. Notice what's happening here. Because you have an ability that lets you fully negate being killed, but your defenses are so hilariously inadequate, building survivability stats isn't good even though they exist for those characters. And the reason is that the game's damage and the tools given to the player, other than damage reduction and stuff to survive, are calibrated in such a way as to make it so you can't fudge the envelope that much, basically. In Guild Wars 2, very different type of Holy Trinity tank healer DPS situation. Guild Wars 2's is much more gray. People are doing splashes of each. The amount of damage enemies are doing is much closer to being an amount that you could survive for a few hits, even if you spent minimal build resources on that. And you can also much more granularly like divert resources to get a meaningful amount of that. Looking at it another way, you could also have a game that had more severe diminishing returns. So to get a lot of tankiness, you have to devote all your gear to damage reduction stat. I don't know, whatever you want to call it, toughness or something. But if the game gives you less and less damage reduction, the more of it you build. This is common. The more armor you get, the less damage reduction per point of armor you get. That also means that the first little bit you get is worth a lot. So it can be possible, if the damage is balanced just so, that it's good for players that aren't built as a tank to splash damage reduction, and it's also good for players that are a tank to stack damage reduction. There are other ways this can be true. In Warframe, for example, there's a lot of Warframes that have massive base health and modest base armor, damage reduction for health, and the reverse. They have modest base health, but they have massive armor, damage reduction for health. And the result is that there are a lot of characters that are you can make pretty much every Warframe be survivable on the Steel Path, like the hard mode missions. But the way you get there doesn't usually look the same on the very surface. It is constructed largely the same way, with a mix of damage reduction and health, creating a large effective health pool, how much damage you can take in practice. But it doesn't look the same. Like your armor number and health number on 10 different tanky warframes will be different numbers meaningfully, right? But that's not trivial to do. Like that is, I'm not saying that's a bad assumption. It is an assumption. Like there are games that are designed to like not do that. Sufficient knowledge of this subject would allow you to look at something like World of Warcraft's build system, Guild Wars 2's build system, and Warframe's build system, and conclude whether it would be good to splash survivability in those games without playing them. Why you would want to do this, I think, is actually really obvious, but I suppose we'll leave for a topic later in the parlay. What is the point of discussing this subject? Uh, that's one of them. You can kind of eyeball it on a game. Let's spend a few minutes breaking down different types of survivability more, since we're kind of already on that topic. And then I want to give you an example of how we could apply or like laterally use this information. So Bionicme continues, means of survivability could perhaps be defined usefully into three main categories, with various subcategories, examples thereof non-exhaustive. Increasing the amount of incoming damage you can handle, increasing maximum health points, healing. Another category, reducing the damage attacks deal to you, or avoiding it entirely, damage reduction, pool gating. In other words, if you would lose all of a type of health thing, resource, health or shields, all at once, is there something that stops you? One shot protection, basically. Blocking, dodging, debuffing enemies so they do less damage is basically the same as damage reduction, or might multiply with it depending on the game, might just add to it depending on the game. And then another category, preventing enemy attacks in the first place, crowd control, stunning the enemies, stealth, avoiding the enemies, positioning, so they have a harder time hitting you, having someone else be attacked in your stead, a taunt, or killing the enemies, often said to be the best form of damage reduction, as dead enemies deal 0 damage. An ability that one-shots an enemy gives you 100% damage reduction from that enemy after the ability hits, because the enemy is dead. So they're, yeah, these different categories and subcategories can often, though not always, be considered as separate multipliers to your survivability, but their efficacy will be very dependent on context. For example, increasing both max HP and damage reduction will likely be more efficient than just focusing on one or the other. Right. If you have the ability to take your 100 health to 200 and to take your damage reduction to 50%, it's better to take your damage reduction to 50% and get 200 health than it is to get 300 health, because 200 health and 50% damage reduction is 400 effective health, but 300 health is less than the number 400. So that's a contrived example, but most games in my experience are balanced this way, where it will pretty much never be good to stack only one thing or the other unless there's a different thing you're multiplying with it. For example, I have a build in Elden Ring where I stack max HP and largely neglect damage reduction, and the reason is that I have effects which restore health based on a percent of my max HP. The result is that max HP is a multiplier for those abilities, healing, and I'm using that as damage reduction, kind of. I heal based on a percent like that. Damage reduction would be a multiplier for both of those things. Damage reduction would be good on that build, but I don't have the room for it. So that, be that as it may. I mean, I have some damage reduction on that build. Anyway, whatever, you get the point. It's Elden Ring, it's kind of different like that. There are also, of course, cases where these multipliers don't interact favorably. For example, there's a complicated relationship in most games between stunning enemies and damage reduction, health regen, max health and such. If you stun an enemy, your damage reduction and health regen if you're not damaged is worthless because it's not doing anything while the enemy is stunned. This can be a little complicated to evaluate. I mean, does that mean the stun is bad on that build? Well, what if the game really wants you to be able to interrupt enemies? Well, I would say it's more helpful to think of that as meaning that the damage reduction and the health regen are bad in that game. The game wants you to have a stun, and wanting to have a stun makes damage reduction worse. Therefore, the game disfavors damage reduction some amount. This might not mean you abandon it, it might just mean you build less of it. Yeah. And you can also use this to diagnose whether games will be a sensible fit for a type of survivability. Healing and increased max health can effectively function as the same multiplier, but have their strengths highlighted in different scenarios. If you need to not get one-shotted, you need more max health on hand. If you can survive a little while or you have a way to stun enemies, health regen can be really good if you do it after you take a hit. You buy time to regenerate health. A game where damage wears you down over a longer period of time may make healing incredibly valuable, but the ability to full heal in 2 seconds may not be very useful in a game where your max health is so low that you regularly die in just 1 second. Right, or like another way to think about this is how bad or avoidable overhealing is in a game. There are games where this is silly and it doesn't make sense to focus on it. You're going to waste, a decent amount of the healing from your flasks in Elden Ring or whatever, topping yourself off because enemies do big chunks of your health bar relatively infrequently. Whereas there are lots of games where it's possible to get to a point where you get hit every second, but it does a very, very small amount of your health per hit. And so your health bar really steadily, very kind of controllably or visibly, noticeably decreases in a way you can kind of hit on the brakes or speed up with or whatever. This is a case where you can also think about, so like in Elden Ring, there are some effects that give you health regen, and it's kind of bad on the surface. You get hit for very big chunks of damage, so that. Stalling to spend time to heal is like the most dangerous thing in the entire game, so there's that. You don't need health regen. If you spend a lot of your time almost dead or at max health, it doesn't like do that much to have health regen. And there are abilities that let you, for the same build slot, you could just block all the incoming damage or a lot of the incoming damage, or like heal more when you heal. Buff the ability of your healing flask to heal you. From a distance, watching a little bit of Elden Ring's gameplay, if I tell you there is health regen in this game, but it's not percent based, it's like a flat amount, you could pretty much without further information conclude that that's probably pretty bad. Like, unless it's really overpowered health regen, that's probably not very good in Elden Ring. You could be told more. For example, that you can't increase the amount of health regen you get by building a stat. For example, there are some incantations, faith spellcasting in Elden Ring, but building more faith does not increase the amount of healing you get from those effects. That's kind of normal. A lot of buffs don't scale in Elden Ring, but the result is that you can't like build to make that healing stronger. Or can you? Because of course building damage reduction increases the amount of health regen you get by making the health you regenerate be worth more health. You don't increase the amount of health points you get, but you just make those be worth more. You gain 3 health per second, but you make it so 3 health per second has 50% damage reduction. Obviously, it's worth significantly more. You basically increased the health regen. You just can't increase the health regen number itself. The game doesn't let you build that multiplier. But that actually looks different. That's like the game nerfed health regen because you don't want too many multipliers available for it. That makes it seem like, I smell that this might be somewhat strong if applied the right way. I don't think it is, by the way. If you play Elden Ring, it is enticing to know that a lot of health regen sources stack. To save you some time, if you play this game, basically, all the incantation spells don't stack, but pretty much everything else does. So the Icon Shield, the Dew Talisman, Blessed Dew, I don't remember what it's called. It's a talisman that gives you health regen. And then there's Holy Ground, Ash of War, that you put on shields. You have to stand in the area to get the health regen. It gives you damage reduction too. Very nice. And then you can pick one incantation, whichever one you have the faith for, to heal you. All that stuff stacks. You can't increase the number of the health that it's regenerating. It's all a flat value, it doesn't scale with your max health, and you can't build a stat to get more of it. But you can do everything else. You can reduce the damage attacks deal to you, avoid it entirely, prevent enemy attacks in the first, all that stuff that we listed earlier. You can do all those things. You just can't make the number on the health regen effect bigger. I think for many people, this can be a useful revelation. If you just want to make a build like that, am I wrong in assuming that this is how many people feel? They simply want to make a build with this or that item, this or that type of effect. They just think it would be fun. And they just want a good version of that build. It doesn't have to be the best one, that arguably doesn't really exist. They're okay with the resulting build not being like one of the strongest builds or whatever. They would just like to get the value out of the thing and experience it. Is that, am I wrong to say that's a common perspective? And a good amount of the time, it is how I feel. You can totally do that. Thinking about things this way, that is a helpful thing to do. You can conclude, okay, well, however effective it is, the way to make it the most effective would be to do these things, or like some of the ways to make it more effective. If you have that health regen, I would also argue that for the most part, it's probably not as good to invest in other healing. You want to set yourself up for a situation where it is relevant to be topped off. You could add advantages for the health regen. For example, there are talismans that give you a big damage boost and a big damage reduction boost when you have max health, specifically max health. Health regen is very good in this situation. If you take a tiny, tiny amount of chip damage, Elden Ring doesn't offer you very many ways to top off your health. Like when you drink a healing flask, you heal for a giant chunk and you don't get that many of those. So, well, you actually get kind of a lot, but you don't want to use them on chip damage. Health regen is very strong in this situation, so it indirectly makes those effects much stronger. And would you look at that? One of them is significant damage reduction when you're at full health in a game where you get hit for a single large hit of damage while you're at full health. And so that was what made health regen seem kind of bad. It turns out it can be what makes it relatively better as well. And thinking through it this way, it's not as bad as people make it out to be. I think it probably doesn't need to be as weak as it is. But you probably safely double the effect of most health regen items in Elden Ring, and it would be like still not very good. And so I think that seems worth doing. For people who maximize it, it will make it more not terrible. And for people who don't maximize it, it's nowhere near making it good on those builds. So who cares, basically? Many builds will build faith. It's a common stat to have. So you have access to some lower rank incantations that restore HP over time. And they're not like really that good, but the opportunity cost of using them is just really low. And so you might put them on. I don't think it would be that bad to just buff those by a bit. Again, it wouldn't be particularly strong on builds that don't optimize it. And on the builds that do optimize it, I mean, the power is still very limited. Like, you're likely the benefit will mostly not be in a game like that, that you heal. You don't need to drink a healing flask. You heal all the way back up from like a big hit. That's not, you probably ought to not do that if you make this build in Elden Ring. You should probably just drink a flask when you take a big hit of damage. It's probably more you top yourself off, or like when you get a big hit and a flask heals you most of the way, this will now heal you the rest of the way, and you ended up getting a lot of healing, like quality of life, I guess. You don't have to top yourself off with another flask. Again, those talismans that give you a bonus when you're at full health, you get it. And this is getting into the thing I'm the most excited about this topic, because I'm extremely interested in this subject in general in game design. And one of the reasons is that you can use it to diagnose and I guess build, in theory, better build systems kind of from the outside. I'll break this down for a minute, and then we're going to get a little bit into the consequences in game design of including these forms of survivability. But I want to give you an example to sort of build on where this can be useful to think about. So this is a situation that's coming from my personal life. I happen to be about to play Clair Obscur Expedition 33. This is a turn-based role-playing game. It's a story-driven game with turn-based combat, and you have the ability to somewhat build your party members. I don't know almost anything about this game, but there's a thing I do know about it, which is that it has the thing where when enemies attack you, you can time a button press and mitigate the damage. You can kind of parry enemy attacks, even though it is otherwise turn-based. That's not turn-based combat, that's Guitar Hero or live action combat. But the rest of it is turn-based combat. It's pretty common to splash this effect if you haven't played a game like this. Paper Mario is the one that comes to mind for me. That franchise does this. Um, Sea of Stars is a recent game I know does this. I haven't played Sea of Stars. Um, it's a thing that exists. Personally, I really don't like it. I don't think that it's just bad. I just want to play a game that is turn-based. I would like to say that I can't resist saying that I am a little bit concerned sometimes in games by the motivation of including this mechanic, as if turn-based combat is just inherently boring, and so making it more like action combat is then better. It's not. You can just enjoy it being turn. There are benefits to it being turn-based. In many ways, if you make a game that is turn-based combat for your turn, but then kind of is live action combat for the opponent's turn, you have to be very aware, right? You have to be primed and be hitting button inputs. That is the worst of both worlds. It gets both the disadvantages of turn-based combat and live action combat. So unless that proves to be worthwhile by then providing some benefit to the gameplay, I don't think that that is a fundamentally very good idea. It's fine that people like it in a lot of games. That's not weird. It makes total sense. You could say it's the benefits of both. You get to enjoy turn-based combat on your turn. Combat is still frequently, but you also get something engaging on the opponent's turn, right? One of the benefits of that parry timing is in turn-based combat, your opponent's turn can be very boring, so adding something for you to do can be good. Sure, that's fine. In a card game, Magic the Gathering, while I'm taking my turn, you can interrupt me and stuff. And you could put such a mechanic in a turn-based game. There is a turn-based way you can do something on your opponent's turn. It doesn't have to be an action input. You could also just think about what you want to do on your turn. I think this is a valuable part of turn-based games, though you could argue it's not super built in. But that's fine. Again, it's okay that people enjoy that. I'm just pointing out, when you analyze that idea in general, let's say you've never seen action parry inputs like that in a turn-based game before. If I pitch it to you that way, it's like, that doesn't sound like an especially good idea, or why do you want to do that? You could make a game like that, and some people would enjoy it, and there's nothing wrong with making a game like that or people enjoying it. But why do you want to make a game that contains that mechanic? And it could just be that's flavor you want. That's fine. In any case, I'm a person who doesn't like this, as you can tell. I have some game design questions about it. I don't think it's bad that people make them. I think I want people to make them. I don't want to make them, and I don't want to play them. I want to eliminate that mechanic, but I want to play this game, and it has those things. Tangent end. It's not that much of a tangent. I want to play the game without ever doing the parry inputs. You see where this is going. Can you do that? Asking someone who has played the game if you can do it sounds like the solution to this problem, but it isn't because they didn't try that, statistically anyway. If you have a friend who proffers up, oh, I just happened to just now, for no reason at all, I feel like telling you that I just completed Clair Obscura Expedition 33 without doing any of the parry inputs. Delightful, excellent timing, comrade. I suppose I'll go forth and do that then. Any tips? And there you go. Fine, sure. But that's not real life. That's not going to happen. You want to intuit whether you will probably be able to do that. And I'm not allergic to the darn things. It's fine if you can't do it. I'm not going to drop the game. But I would like to focus on them less. Can I do that? That improves my desire to play the game if I can do it. Well, the game has some build systems. I've just seen people fiddling around with build options. That alone, the very fact that the game has some build options, people think well of it, and there are those parry inputs, makes me nearly certain that you can play the game without meaningfully using the parry inputs. Maybe you'll be forced to for a tutorial. So a strict, technically correct, push his glasses up nose challenge run, yeah, probably not, but I don't care about that. When you can choose to, can you choose not to do the parry inputs? I can almost guarantee you that you can for the whole game. Why? Well, because they're just another multiplier. They're just a multiplier you don't have to spend build space to get. They're a large damage reduction multiplier, or maybe they block the damage, I don't know, but whatever it is, right, basically, they're a damage mitigation effect, which is in your build by default. I've seen games, in fact, Sea of Stars has an item. My partner played this, that's why I know about it, even though I didn't play it. Where there's this item that lets you trade away the timed inputs, but you get a bonus in exchange, and that's like part of the build system. You can also equip another item that makes the inputs more demanding, but they're more powerful if you land them correctly. So the game lets you fiddle with that. Maybe the game is something like this, but let's assume it doesn't. So there isn't a way to remove or get a compensation for not using the parry inputs. You're just worse off if you don't do them, in theory. And let's also assume like mistiming them doesn't make you take more damage or something. Like you just don't get them. However, the game has build options. And I don't know about you, but if you like making builds in games, you make a playstyle when the game offers it. You don't necessarily always make the most min-max thing of all time. That's not what we're talking about. But you make a deliberate playstyle. You make choices and you've thought about them when you make them. You're making above the curve build decisions in these games designed for the general public, a global market of people who, compared to you, make relatively statistically often less good build decisions. Your build is above the curve of what the game expects. The game is possible to beat with a significantly worse build than yours. So let me ask you, if the parry inputs are just a part of the build system you have by default, you throw them out. Are you not basically just saying the game gives me 10 build slots and I simply will not use one of them or two of them, for example? If you've played a lot of games where you made builds, think back to times where you didn't use absolutely every bit of build space the game gave you to achieve the main effect you wanted from your build. You probably felt this when you were looking at a slot in your build and you went, oh, what do I put here? I gotta shop around for something useful. Well, that slot could benefit you a lot, but you could certainly do the build without filling that slot, right? This is my point. You could absolutely beat most of these games without 100% of the build system. And all the parry input is some amount of the resources the game gives you, some amount of the power budget you can extract from the game's build systems, decisively constructed into a thing for you that you can't choose to make into something else. Or again, maybe you can, but we're assuming you can't in this example. Could you beat the game with only 80% of the build system? I'm positive that I could, right? I'm not trying to brag. I'm just saying in practically every game I've ever seen, of course you could. Many games don't even have enough good options for you to be really using most of the build system. So it is possible the game will offer a lot of build options. Some of them will be survivability. Can you build tankiness on your characters at all in a way other than the parry inputs? I would imagine yes, probably, don't you think? There are tankier characters than others, and there are some items in the game which provide some defensive benefit. It's an assumption, but it's not a very big assumption. So surely you can use those or something, stuns, to mitigate damage. There's a lot of things that can replicate the benefit of damage reduction. When you look at it this way, you can see that that mechanic actually isn't as weird as it seems like it is. In fact, my complaint that it's like not turn-based is a little pedantic. You could just kind of reframe this and say, oh, the game gives you this option where if you're having trouble with the turn-based combat, you can get a little help by trying to time your inputs, but it's just like an extra thing. I doubt the game frames it that way. I don't think a lot of people, from what I've heard about the game, are interpreting it that way, but you could interpret it that way. And it's very likely that the game is possible to play with that mindset and have a very good time and be effective. So I guess we'll find out. But do you see this example? It's interesting, isn't it? You can sort of use this way of analyzing how you can stay alive in a game to intuit things about how a game's build system will be constructed. Do we want to say, do I think that survivability in games is a highlight of many games' build systems? I think I do. I think the caveat that I have there is that it's often like a little dry, like the options in games will be sort of similar, but the opportunity cost, the tension when you pick what you get for survivability, I think is often interesting. We do have to get into one of the quibbles of that kind of thing. You might be saying, Zandy, you're still crazy. You're ultimately trying to build craft out gameplay inputs in Clair Obscur. Like, why? That just seems sort of weird. You're build crafting to make something more passive. Your buildcraft desire is parasitic with the game's gameplay. The more you make a build, the less the game's actual gameplay matters. Now, I don't think this is as bad as that makes it sound. Another way to think of it is you can conquer the challenges the game offers you on a mix of the battle screen and the build screen. And you can change what mix of those things you beat the game on. That's already true of most games with meaningful build systems. You can spend more time labbing out this boss, slamming your head against this boss's attacks in Elden Ring, and or you can spend time tweaking your build to adapt to that boss or try a different tactic that you think might be favorable against that boss. You can go get an item that gives you special damage reduction against that type of damage or something, you know. These are both part of the game. So it's fair to say that they have a positive relationship. The game is better with both of them. I mean, well, you might prefer a game that only has one, but if it's a game about being a variety of options, it's, you know, they have you want both of them. The experiences, you get a mix of them. And it's important, right? You can learn as a human being to dodge enemies you get used to better, but you also get to make it a little easier for yourself by building something stronger. You can do both. If you have a special amount of trouble on a certain boss, you can lean more into the making builds. If you have an easy time with the boss, you can lean more into your physical skill. If you don't have anything that counters a certain boss, you can lean more into just learning to beat the boss. But you don't have to do that on every boss. Some of the bosses, you will have things that, should you wish to use them, counter that boss better. This is a positive part of the game if you are up for it. It has a healthy relationship. So looking at it as, oh, the build system lets you remove gameplay and replace it with making a build is, I don't totally agree with that. I feel like it's just the same. It's like, what flavor do you do? And I think a good build system will need to balance you using the build and you making builds. I think that's an important thing about build systems. But it is worth considering how survivability build craft, as much as maybe the build part is interesting, the gameplay part is often not that interesting. Uh, Another important distinction between different sub and sub categories is the degree of passivity or active player input that determines the function of various means of survivability, which we touched on in the Valkyr parlay. Increasing maximum health and unconditional damage reduction are highly passive, while using gameplay actions that let you block and dodge enemy attacks will be much more active. Maintaining a balance between the two is likely healthy gameplay design, as too strong passive survivability will not need the player to take many actions at all, while focusing on active survivability tends to be more punishing against mistakes. Though, in fairness, there are many games that explore the design space of the latter to good success. Different gameplay genres also invite different takes on these mechanics. For example, a turn based RPG may maintain a similar flavor of blocking or dodging as an action RPG, but will likely be more on the passive side of the spectrum in its gameplay. How you do that blocking might be more passive. Those genre differences are not something I'll personally be looking to explore much here. Sure, I a little bit will. I mean, when you parry in, let's just call it parrying in Clair Obscur, I would imagine, you know, this is easier in the sense that you don't need to move in physical space. Probably not anyway. You could make a game like that, I guess, but I bet they don't have that. I bet you just hit the button at the right time. In consequence, they might choose to make the parry window, how many frames you can hit the button during that will properly block and mitigate the damage of the attack. They might choose to make that window tighter to make it so it's relatively more challenging, despite the fact that you only have to time it, you don't have to position or anything because it's turn-based combat. Or they might make it a broader parry window, possibly because the game isn't focused on those mechanical skills and they just want it to be an element of the game to keep the player engaged. They don't want it to be primarily where the game's challenge comes from. It depends. Again, I don't know. These are just things, those aren't the only reasons you could do one or the other. I guess we'll find out, or I guess I won't find out very much. But it's interesting. It is interesting how in a lot of games the parry window is often bigger than you expect, and it's mostly the timing, like when are you meant to hit the button. In a lot of games I've played, if you count the number of frames that you have to parry, if you assigned that amount of time to when you think you should parry, in other words, you're trying to parry a boss's attack and you're failing. If you could move the number of parry frames, let's say 10 frames that you have to hit the parry input, if you could move those to when you think you should parry, you would get it right every time in almost every game's parry system. Only very strict parry windows would do that. it's almost always that you don't know when to parry attacks. This is one of the things I really don't like about parrying in a lot of games. A lot of the time, the difficulty, either the timing is so tight that doing it consistently doesn't really exist, or the timing is loose enough that it can only be hard if it is not clear when you are meant to hit the button. There's also examples where the mechanics can be a little weird. It's when you press the button versus when you release the button in different games. I love to hate parrying as a mechanic. Like I love that it exists in gaming so much, but I believe it is a glorious disaster of game design communication most of the time. And that a lot of games it's actually kind of shallow, but the difficulty is derived from the graphics pretty much, which I don't think is interesting, but I want to like. I love parrying in games where it's not like that. It's just that no games that fit the description are currently coming to mind. So maybe I'll love it in Clair Obscure. Who knows? I don't know. It's turn-based combat. That could be a benefit of parrying. It's more clear. Anyway, the important part about this, though, is the idea that you're balancing the passive and active input. And the player can choose this for themselves. They could say, well, I'm going to be surrounded by a lot of small enemies, but I want to focus on looting. There's a rare item or a quest I want to do. Maybe you would like to have more passive survivability, which the game will likely make weaker at its strongest than active forms of survivability, like dodging or blocking or parrying. But maybe you don't need that much survivability. On the other hand, as you get stronger, you can choose to trade away passive survivability you decide you don't need for active survivability, and this can be an interesting design choice. Something I think is particularly interesting about the passive and active survivability thing in game design is that when a player can exchange their skill as a part of the build system, we're right back to that thing about the parry inputs in Clair Obscure just being like a 10th slot in the build system that is decided for you to be damage reduction when you hit an input at the right time. The player is now part of the build system. The opportunity cost in the build system sort of changes. This is a little weird. It's a little tricky because this means that a player very skilled arguably gets more build slots if the game has a high enough skill ceiling that is feasibly attainable by normal players who don't spend a ridiculous amount of time on the game or are outliers statistically in terms of skill. This means that for some people, the build system just has more slots or space in it because they can forego massive amounts of survivability. The trick, in my opinion, is to make it so you care about the passive survivability. It's valuable, and even rather skilled players won't completely forego it, but you still make a decision about how much of it you want to have. You have it so active survivability is valuable enough that you will trade some passive survivability for it, but you won't trade too much or all passive survivability for it, if that makes sense. I think that is valuable in these games. At first, it seems scary to let players like vary the amount of space in the build system, but the point of a build system is that it be their choice, is that there be an opportunity cost. If a player is so arrogant that they believe that survivability of any kind is worth absolutely nothing, well, let them think that. That's okay. But I think the ideal is to dial it in such that the player includes their skill in the build system, but it isn't worth too much to have that skill. It's not worth too much or too little. If the game is going to be like this is also the part of the discussion where we'll briefly derail and say, you could just not let the player modify their survivability. I think this is a relatively undersung option. If you don't want to limit the impact of the player's skill on the game, if you don't want to make the game about a combination of effects causing you to succeed, just don't. You can just not allow the player to modify their survivability with the build system. Now, the current state of the industry, nobody thinks about this. As far as I've never heard of a game that's like this. I'm sure they exist, but it's extremely unlikely in my Clair Obscure example that the game will contain no survivability increasing options. That, like in the current industry, that's almost unheard of. But in an abstract sense, if you think about game design, which is not where most of these things came from, the build system was a side effect of the thing the game is built around. They need a build system for you to have this experience. But what is in the build system is just kind of, they populate it with the things. But if you think about game design from the ground up and make a build system first, you could totally have a game where it didn't really fit the gameplay formula for you to put the player's skill into the build system. Thus, you just leave survivability out and make it so you really only build damage, how you execute your damage. This can still put the player's skill into the build system. For example, you make an ability which does a lot of damage, but it takes longer to execute. Well, that's basically just trading away survivability. It's riskier to execute the move for damage. You do more damage if it hits. So, in a way, it's a little artificial. But you can imagine you could make a game where it was meaningful to pick how you did damage, but you cannot meaningfully like use your physical skill at staying alive to like affect how you did the damage. Like it just wouldn't really matter, and thus the build system would be sort of similar for a lot of people. You could. I don't feel like you need to do that. It's okay for it to be that way. But it is worth considering. Like you could just not, if it sounds bad to let the player, have their skill only be so impactful, you could just make a game that doesn't have this. This is a great example of why you definitely do not want a build system in every game. There's lots of gameplay formulas, game design ideas that it doesn't serve that design for you to be able to pick like how much of your skill you incorporate into the build system. That's not good for many of these games. And indeed, I think the people fixated on games like the Souls likes being like about your mechanical skill purely, like on paper they're just not. I mean, they it's a significant factor, but there is a very large amount of the game that is not about that. And many of the parts of the design arguably kind of meter how much that matters in a way. You could look at it a different way and say your skill lets you magnify the benefit of the build system. But I hope you can see how, in the grand scheme of things, it actually reduces the gap between people who are less skilled and more skilled, not increase it. And so I would argue that is the game relatively mitigating the effect of your skill. You can be modestly skilled and get a big effect. Being ridiculously skilled doesn't yield much more of an effect. You will quickly have no use for many parts of the build system. Incidentally, this is probably also a time to mention that populating your build system with a variety of effects is good if you want this to be the case, right? If you want the build system to matter, even if the player is very skilled, you likely want to populate it with a large variety of effects so that if the player is so skilled they can completely forego a type of effect, like survivability, they can still populate all of the build system with some other effect. Should you want the game to not overly reward skill, you can make the game relatively hard, but be sure that people who are ridiculously skilled won't have no experience at all. They won't just erase the difficulty from existence. They'll still have a fun fight. This can be a positive thing. You can make it so there aren't too many ways to increase one's damage, for example. In Elden Ring, damage boosts often multiply, but it is a little bit difficult to make a build that will have all of its talisman slots filled with just things that increase your damage, that are all active most of the time, that are all multiplicative with each other. That is not impossible to do, but it's not really easy to do. And the reason is that it would overly reward skill, I would argue. It would overly reward skill. It's still pretty rewarding of skill. Multiplying the benefit that the player gets from a few damage options. Something gives you 10% damage when this happens, and something gives you 10% damage while this is active. Those effects multiplying is a fairly big deal. That's a really big piece of pressure lighting a fire under the player to say, if you can make the space for this, you get a big benefit. But then restricting the amount of ways you can get those effects makes it so the benefit is also not too large. The pressure is on the player, but the ceiling for the reward for that, fulfilling that pressure, is not ridiculously high. You can't not get damage unless you forego all survivability. That's not how the game feels. Yet they can have their cake and eat it too. You still feel pressure to forego some survivability for damage. That's still a tension the game has. Very nice. I think that's really well done. And it's done by mitigating how many of an effect you can have easy access to. You can actually really easily get 4 damage multiplying effects on your talismans in Elden Ring, but you would have to do a lot of things to set up those conditions a lot of the time. And that would mean the rest of your loadout would need to be quite preoccupied with keeping those effects active most of the time. There are some builds, but anyway. Yeah, so that's really interesting. That I think is one of the key things about this for me, is that it can be nice to include the player into the game's build system, but you can still balance that. I know it seems weird. You can't know how powerful the player is. Power, well, how much power budget worth of build system item the player is bringing to the table. The player's build is their build stuff, and then if the game has any mechanical skill, it's also their mechanical skill slot that they put in when they play the game. My hands, I guess, are the final part of my build system, or my brain, you could say as another one. You can't know how good at the game these players will be, but interestingly, I hope I've explained in a useful way, you can balance how much of a benefit players get from that stuff. It's just a little indirect how you do that, but you absolutely can like change how much it matters how good the player is. This might sound obvious. Again, you're thinking, oh, make the game random. That's why I didn't lead by describing it that way. Changing how much the player's skill affects the outcome of the game sounds very easy to do one way, which is you just make the outcome random. But what I wanted to illustrate to you is that you can change how much the player's skill affects the outcome without making the outcome any more random, just by balancing things in a different way, which I think is very interesting using opportunity cost. So, very cool. I guess what you're doing is the opportunity cost of the player being bad is made worse or better in the game's build system, like higher or lower. So, fascinating. I think a really useful thing to look at in games. This is also, it's worth noting, not the same thing as a game being harder or easier either. You're just saying how much does it matter how different the player's skill level is from other players. You could say that the game doesn't reward players' skill very much, but requires a rather high level of skill. To do this thing at all, you need relatively high skill, but it doesn't reward more skill than that very much. You could make a game like that. You could make a game that rewarded skill very little. You don't need to be very skilled to do this. And if you are very skilled, it does almost nothing more. You can't really be better at it. That's easy to make. You could make a game with a very wide range there if you wanted to, etc. And this is a thing that games do. I am dismayed that in many games, I think it is clear that this is not completely on purpose. It kind of just ends up happening. Like, that's what happens. But I do think that limiting the number of options the player is given for things like damage boost, that is a thing the developers of Elden Ring, for example, almost certainly did think about. I'm not sure they thought of it as the build system way of thinking about it, which is this is a way to balance the player's skill level in the game. I don't think they thought that. That is what it does, but I don't think that that is why they put those things in the game. But the result of them, one of the results of them, is that the player's skill matters only so much. It's interesting, isn't it, with how people are in a tizzy about how sweaty those games are. They're, only modestly so. You take a shower afterward, but I mean, come on. Who doesn't after a session of gaming, if you will? It's interesting then to note how much of the design serves making it not too important that the player is very skilled. That's like arguably one of the most important parts of that formula. Hollow Knight is also another game that comes to mind. These really hard games often have this interesting dynamic where they're making a point to make it so it isn't out of control how beneficial skill is, which I think is funny. I think they're often not thought of that way. But you'll note that they have prominent build systems. Hollow Knight, it's not much of a build system as such, but you certainly make build system like decisions. You just can't make very disparate playstyles with those decisions. But they're there to do very little other than meter how much the player's skill matters. It still matters a lot, but not as much as it would if those things were not there, is the point. I think we covered this topic to my extreme satisfaction. In future Parley, please keep doing this series. I want to highlight the interactions between these means of survivability in some specific builds. Cool. And other circumstances that I found remarkable, and also expand a bit on my definitions of the subcategories, which I'm sure don't all seem entirely intuitive by the names I've written them here. Yeah, that would be interesting. I definitely don't. It's not really related to the parlay, so I didn't get into it. But I definitely don't totally agree with these categories. Like, I feel like dodging is more. It's more useful to think of dodging as more similar to crowd control. They both negate all benefit of your survivability as it affects damage reduction, but they make health regen a little better because they make the fight longer sometimes, or they make you survive for longer. I think that's useful if you want to view them as like multipliers or different like types of effect. I would categorize them something more like things that multiply your effective health, things that give you absolute defense, dodging, stunning the enemy, avoiding the enemy, invisibility, maybe, and then like wild card or specific effects. Again, I think health regen is a really interesting and complicated one. I love health regen in pretty much every game. I don't know why I'm so fixated on health regen. I guess it's kind of because of this. It's just really interesting. I think it's also like amazing how differently effective it is in different games. This is very neat. You could do a whole thing. You could review every game with a build system by how it has or does not have health regen and how good that is. And that would be a surprisingly effective way to talk about survivability. There's a parlay topic if you are desperate for one. Looking forward to more of this series. Folks, if you want your own parlay like this one, you can get that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one.